I'm Mordechai Becher. Welcome to the Gateways Parshat vlog. We are currently reading in the Torah readings various sections that deal with the building of the tabernacle, the Mishkan, the temple, the vessels of the temple, the sacrifices, the clothing of the Kohanim, the priests, the high priest, etc., etc. Very complicated and very detailed laws about this. And so I've been looking at a book called Torah Sa'olah, the Teachings of the Offering, by Rabbi Moshe Isserles. A lot of people have not heard of this book. Rabbi Moshe Isserles, people have heard of. He was born in Krakow in 1520 and was contributed to the Code of Jewish Law. The Code of Jewish Law, Shulchan Aruch, written by Rabbi Yosef Karo in the 16th century, but primarily from a Sephardic perspective in terms of halachic approaches, legal approaches, and also in terms of custom. Rabbi Moshe Isserles of Krakow, his contribution was to add to the Code of Jewish Law what he called the Mapah. Code of Jewish Law in Hebrew is Shulchan Aruch, which means a set table. Rabbi Moshe Isserles added something called the Mapah, which means a tablecloth. He said the table is not quite set, it needs something else, so he put a tablecloth on it. What's the tablecloth consist of? The Ashkenaz or European Jewish approach to Jewish law and also to customs. And that is what he is most famous for. But he wrote a number of other books which are fascinating. One of them is called Mechir Hayayim, which means the cost of wine. Krakow, a lot of people in Krakow were evacuated due to a plague, and he ended up in Ramah. Rabbi Moshe Isserles ended up in a small village in which there was almost no food, no water. It was just terrible, disastrous, and very, very difficult time for him. And it was around Purim, and he couldn't afford wine for Purim. He couldn't afford food at that time in exile, even though he was a wealthy man, just wasn't to be had. So he wrote a book called The Cost of Wine. Instead of wine, he says, I'm going to write a commentary on the Scroll of Esther. It's an amazing commentary on the Scroll of Esther. But anyway, the book that I'm talking about is this book, which is called Torah Sa'olah, which is a 400-page, 500-page, depending on the edition, discussion of the philosophical underpinnings, the mystical ideas and symbolism of every single detail of the temple service, the offerings, the clothing of the high priest. Literally every detail is discussed by Rabbi Moshe Isserles. This particular edition obviously it was written in his lifetime in the 16th century. This edition was published in the 1850s, 19th century. And one of the interesting aspects of this was published in Poland, but in order to publish a book, what they used to do is to sell advance copies. So you would subscribe to an advance copy of the book and then send in your money, and then the author, the publisher, would have the money to pay for it. So what I find interesting, just about, aside from the content of the book, which is absolutely amazing, consists of a lot of philosophy. He used heavily the work of Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. He also quotes the Zohar, the mystical text of the Kabbalah. So it's a very diverse type of book. In other words, includes everything from the rationalist views of Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed to the Kabbalistic views of the Zohar and everything in between. It's absolutely amazing. But what I found interesting was just a side point is looking at the subscriber list at the end of the book. And it tells you who bought copies, every single person who bought a copy. And the towns are interesting. Suwałk, which was a town in Europe. A very famous rabbi from there became a teacher at Yeshiva University, known as a Suwałka Rov. Bialystok, which I'm sure everyone has heard of. Brisk was the home of the Soloveitchik family, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, Reb Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, etc. And we find purchases from there by various people. One of them is the Verhaftig family that purchased quite a few copies. Later on, one of the Verhaftigs moved to Vilna. He became a lawyer, and he was actually instrumental in saving the Mir Yeshiva during the Second World War, getting them visas via Sempo Sugihara to get to Japan, and from there to Shanghai. And he later on became a member of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. Very interesting fellow. We have Rav David Teveler from Minsk, who is the Av Beis Din, the head of the court, the Jewish court in Minsk. very, very great Talmud scholar, wrote a commentary on the entire Talmud. We moved to Karlin. These are towns that probably people have heard of. I'm looking at Kovno. Kovno had a famous kollel. At the time, the person who headed the kollel was Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. People will have heard of him as the founder of the Musar movement, a movement to study ethical texts and for people to focus on character development and ethical improvement. And he had bought an advanced copy of this book when he was living in Kovno, Plotsk. Again, a lot of places, Kalish, and then you have each town also has a little list at the end of orchim, of guests. So in Kovno, people would come from all over to learn, to study in the famous kollel, the famous advanced yeshiva there. One of the people came from Volozhin, which was, of course, is now in Belarus, but then was a famous Lithuanian yeshiva. And you have all types of people buying, and numerous towns would buy a few copies so they could have it in their synagogue, in their shul. So anyway, I just wanted to point out it's an amazing book. Doesn't really need my haskama, my approbation, but it's always fascinating to know the type of books that people wrote, which we're not really familiar with. We're familiar sometimes with their major works, but not with other works which don't get enough attention. Torah Sa'olah is a work which should get more attention. There is a nice modern critical edition that has been published in 2 volumes, actually readable, as opposed to mine, which is very difficult to read. But it's type of fun studying from a book which is over close to 200 years old, and which has got names of prestigious rabbis who subscribe to it to help in its publication, towns that really have no Jewish presence anymore since the Second World War, but once were great centers of Jewish learning. It's really an amazing thing to hold something like this and to actually study from it. Have a wonderful Shabbos. This is Mordechai Becher with the Gateway's Parshat.